717 Credit Union, savings power to give your business an extra boost. Business savings, certificates, and business money market. 717 Credit Union, make your money work as hard as you do. Check out our business money market and CD rates at 717cu.com/rates.
First, we're going to start with the concept of land acknowledgement. And a lot of people are doing it these days, and it's a good thing to take the time and the opportunity to learn about the people that were here before recorded history and even in the recorded area of what we call the contact period, so that we have a better understanding of the whole human history of our community and our state and our nation. So there's a lot of ways to define it, and I've looked at that in the past, and I found this one, which I'm partial to, and in terms of the question of what is land acknowledgement, it's an indigenous land or territorial acknowledgement that is a statement that recognizes the indigenous peoples who have been dispossessed from the homelands and territories upon which an institution was built and currently occupies and operates in. And this was written and posted by Lauren Valentino Bryant, and she's with Shoreline Community College. Now, these land acknowledgement statements are supposed to be concise but also informative in terms of who we're talking about. And it's easier for some institutions to do this than others. And I'll give an example of that in the Ohio History Connection, formerly known as the Ohio Historical Society, which is a statewide organization that has multiple sites in all parts of the state of Ohio. And they have deferred on land acknowledgements because where do they begin? And but they are very much dedicated to preserving the history of indigenous people as part of the whole story of Ohio. And so, again, it's a matter of whether it works and can be done concisely within a community or an organization or any landowner. Now, some definitions as we go along here. We've heard Native American Indians, Native Americans, indigenous peoples, and some ask which is appropriate in this day and age, and I think all of them are. And if you're with people who are of this heritage, often it's polite, first of all, to listen to them, but also to hear how they refer to themselves. And so those are very much appropriate. Of course, in Canada, they often refer to their indigenous people as First Nations people. And but we tend to use the Native American, American Indian, or indigenous here in the United States. And what is first contact? That's another story. And again, it's variable, because in our recorded history, we know that as far as this country and this part of North America and really the Caribbean as well, Christopher Columbus in 1492 made first contact with the indigenous people of Hispaniola, which today are the countries of Haiti and Dominican Republic. We also know that Norsemen, who started moving westward from Scandinavia through the archipelagos above Scotland to Iceland to Greenland, they had contact with indigenous people in Newfoundland, Leif Erikson in particular, and Labrador in northern Canada, going back to the late 10th and even 11th century, about half a millennium before Christopher Columbus. And also we know that the indigenous people of this hemisphere came from Asia. And this is a wonderful map that you see up here that shows the process. And during the last ice age, the Wisconsin period starting more than 16,000 years ago, people started coming across the land bridge that existed because so much of the water was caught up in ice to come across from Asia into North America. And that went throughout and toward the end of the Wisconsin Ice Age, and even after the glaciers receded and the ocean filled up again and you had the Bering Land Bridge become the Bering Strait. Still, if you look at it on a map, it's a fairly narrow piece of water to navigate. So along with the earliest indigenous settlers here, there's been a migration coming from Asia a long time after that as well, because of opportunities or exploration, which seems to be part of human nature. And so let's talk about here in the Mahoning Valley. Really, first contact we can say would have been in the 17th century, because you had indigenous people living here going back thousands of years, but it was the 17th century as European settlers were coming in the East Coast, going through the St. Lawrence and Great Lakes. Predominantly hunters, trappers, and traders would have come through our area as well as many others and encountered indigenous people along the way. Now, we don't know most of the names, or we don't know any of the names really before the 17th century here in the Mahoning Valley and in Ohio to look at it larger, but we do have periods where things happened and you had levels of technological development. And here's a little timeline, makes it very concise. At the bottom you can see what I'll be talking about for the next few minutes, and then taken out of that will be the woodland period, which actually straddles the Common Era between before Common Era and after the Common Era. So from about 13,000 to 1,000 BCE, you had paleo peoples who were big game hunters and gatherers, and that technology gave way to the archaic period, which again were hunters and gatherers, but they were also early agriculturalists. And so the tools and the projectile points reflect where they were in terms of how they gathered and produced their food. Not much else exists, either because of the time and the breakdown of their artifacts, but we get next between 1000 BCE and 1000 CE, and that's that woodland period that you see on the screen there, the white timeline. And it starts with the Adena people, who were the earliest culture of this time, then Hopewell, and then you have intrusive mounds. But what all these people have in common is earthworks and different levels of intricacy to the earthworks and serving different purposes. But they were hunters and farmers and earthwork builders, and they settled into more permanent communities here in the valley and also through Ohio. And this period, in terms of Ohio and earthworks, is really rich. And here's a map of Ohio from a 1914 atlas that described the indigenous peoples' earthworks, resources, archaeological sites throughout the state. And if you look at it, I'm going to bring the little pointer over here. See that red dot? Look at the southern part of the state, and you see all that red there? This is 1914, and there's been many more sites uncovered since then, but this whole area, the Miami watershed, the Scioto watershed, the Muskingum watershed, has huge amounts and very rich sites for earthworks and also archaeology. And then as you get further out, it becomes much less. And now, this is a disclaimer here. We're talking about known sites. There is so much we don't know because it's buried or it's already been destroyed. But you get up to Mahoning County here in northeast Ohio, and there's really only one little red dot, but that's significant, and I'm going to talk about it in a couple of minutes here. But if you travel Ohio, and I strongly recommend that you do as far as the richness of the earthworks and sites, this is part of the Hopewell mound sites. These are the high bank areas that are shown on this map. It's actually a drawing going back, and look at the intricacy of the designs, how they're connected, and once you get on the site, things start to come together more, but it's just amazing to see how careful they were in putting together their land and creating these earthworks as part of their culture. And of course, these Hopewell sites, many of them have recently been put together in UNESCO's World Heritage Site. So we have this World Heritage Site now in the state of Ohio, which is a really big deal. And so this particular high bank site is south of Chillicothe in Ross County. And you can see the Scioto River there at the top. This may be familiar to a lot of people located in northern Adams County here in Ohio. It's the Serpent Mound. And we don't know precisely when it was built, and it's possibly it was built in an early time and then rebuilt later. But it is an effigy mound, one of the most spectacular in this continent, showing a snake form, and it looks like it's devouring an egg at the northern end of it. And of course, we suppose what was meant there, but a lot of the astronomical connections are there through the undulations and the direction that it's pointed. And it's really a spectacular site, and this is one that I've been to. I almost want to recommend you go in the winter when I did, because it's so quiet, and you have nothing to focus on but the mound itself, and there's an observation tower. It's really, really something you should do. Now, we have that one site in Mahoning County. It's westernmost at the top of Smith Township in a little borough called North Benton, and right off of Route 14, going between Salem and Deerfield. And this mound was discovered as people started settling around what is now North Benton. And it was a full mound until about 1837, when the owner of the property, named Judge William Smith, decided to cut off the top and flatten out the mound. And then when he died in 1837, his will called for him to be buried on top of the mound. And it was a strange request then, possibly now too, but that's what happened. And then around 1939, you had a team of archaeologists headed by Willis McGrath, who excavated the site to find out what was in the mound, and they found out a lot. And this is the mound, what's underneath it. It is a burial mound, but what they found, and you can see on the edge there's a north arrow pointing. So the largest feature of it is this eagle effigy right in the middle, and it's facing due east. And then there's a perimeter of stone all the way around it, and there's holes that probably held posts. So before this site was buried by the people who built it, presumably, it had some sort of pavilion or cover over it. And because of what's inside the mound, it was most likely a necropolis, meaning a place where they buried and honored the dead, prepared bodies, cremated bodies. In some cases, if you look and can see on either wing of the eagle, there are full burials of bodies there. And then there's another one over here, which is actually in a stone sarcophagus almost. And then there are cremains around it too. And so that was what's going on there. It was then buried and left in its state until it was excavated. This work and the findings of this dig were published in 1945, and then wisely they covered it over again. And there's a cross-section down below here that shows that at one time it had a flagpole and then the headstone for Judge Smith. But all the till was pushed over on the side when it was flattened out. But it's again covered to the depth that it was, which is about 6 feet off the ground. I don't know where it is in North Benton. I drive through there every once in a while. I know it's on private property, but it's something of great importance to understanding Indigenous history here in the Mahoning Valley in particular. Now, let's push on to the next era, which was from about 1000 to 1600, and referred to as the Fort Ancient era. And these are people, the prehistoric, that we know are the direct ancestors to the cultures, tribes, nations, and confederacies who existed at contact with Europeans. And there are earthwork sites for the Fort Ancient era, including one called Fort Ancient here in Ohio. But one of the things that came out of this era that carried over into the historic period after contact was the longhouse. And you can see a couple of photos. This is from a park in New York. The structure of the longhouse, aptly named, but it was communal living inside, and you can see the inside space as it was recreated to show how these people lived together in that era. Other things that they're well known for is their metalwork. They were an agricultural society. They had very extensive trade networks and well-defended and sited villages with earthworks, palisades, and they tended to locate their villages on high ground so they could view everything around them. Now, moving into the 17th century, there was a group of people called the Erie, and they were also referred to as the Cat People or the Cat Nation. But we knew them, and Europeans knew them as the Erie people. And here's a 17th century map made by French explorers, and you can see it's not true to scale, but you can see some very familiar things like Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, and then the whole shoreline down here is called the place of the Erie, or where they lived. And then also, which is significant, on the southern shore of Lake Ontario, and even on the northern shore above there, it's where the Iroquois, the Six Nation Confederacy, lived. And the Erie and the Iroquois did not get along. And that blew up into a 5-year-long war between the Erie and the Iroquois that resulted in basically the extinction of the Erie people. Now, what does that mean in terms of what happened? Well, the Iroquois at the end of this war overran the Erie and captured their land, probably burned down villages whenever they found them. And the people of the Erie who were left either had to, if they weren't killed, they assimilated into the Iroquois culture, or they were driven off the land and went somewhere else. And but we're pretty sure, because of the wide span of the Erie, that they also inhabited the Mahoning Valley here. Now, between 1600 and 1750, more influential things are happening because of the French and British expanding their colonial holdings here in North America and being natural adversaries and rivals. they were influencing the people they were running into and trading with and negotiating for land. And so you started to see alliances form between indigenous people and either the French or the British in this time period. And that takes us up to the 1750s, where you have a period over the next 20 years, 25 years of great significance to this part of North America, but also to all the peoples who inhabited it in the mid-18th century. First you had the French and Indian War, 1754 to 55, followed by the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763. And this entirely changed the demographic and political landscape in the Great Lakes, Ohio region. And I mentioned the confederacies that grew. For the British and American colonists in this war, it included the Iroquois Confederacy, the Wyandot of Ohio Country, Catawba, Cherokee Nation, and Mingo, which I'll talk about who the Mingo were a little bit later. And those who sided with the French were the Abenaki, Algonquin, the Lenape, we call Delaware as well, Ojibwa, Ottawa, Shawnee, and Wyandot of the Fort Detroit area. Now, over the course of this war, we know that Great Britain won decisively and completely changed the future for the colonies here. And looking at 1763, when you had the treaty that ended the war, basically all the French claims to land in what's now the United States east of the Mississippi River transferred to the British, and the French were on the other side of the river in the Louisiana Territory. But there were a lot of disaffected indigenous people because of this war, and there was a lot of tension naturally between the indigenous people who occupied this part of the country and colonists who were starting to move ever westward, looking for more land and more opportunities. And part of that year in deciding the war was the proclamation of 1763. And what that proclamation declared was that all lands west of the Appalachian Allegheny Mountain Range, and you can see on this map, the dark green would be the British colonies, and a lot of this follows the summits of the Appalachian, or the Alleghenies in the north, and then the Appalachian Range going south into Georgia. And basically saying that the English colonists had east of there, and the indigenous people had to the west. Now, no colonists were to move into the west without express permission from the king. Now, that was the theory. In practice, you're talking about a boundary line that's over 1,000 miles long. And I think if Great Britain had put all of their colonial military into North America, and along that line there would still be gaping holes in it. So it didn't really hold very well, and tensions continued from 1763 on up into the American Revolution, which started in 1775. Also, what this proclamation did is those indigenous people that had claims east of the mountains gave those up and came to the west. And so this is where you have in Ohio and in the lower Ohio Valley and elsewhere a conglomeration of tribes, nations, peoples trying to find their way in this new structure that is the British colonies. And again, a lot of tension continued out of that. Also in this time, the Iroquois Confederacy, which had been most powerful in the 17th and early 18th century, they gave up their land claims to the lower Ohio Valley and south of the Ohio River, but through disease and other factors, they really started to diminish in their power in the region, but also in the number of people that were part of the Iroquois Confederacy. Now, we often forget in talking about the American Revolution that it wasn't all about the East Coast. I mean, this was literally a two-front international war going on in what is now the United States and the original 13 colonies. And that's important here in Ohio, definitely, because the fighting that occurred on the East Coast really wrapped up in 1781 in Yorktown, when the British forces surrendered and got on their ships and took off. But the war was not over by any imagination or stretch of the imagination. It went on for another year and a half, predominantly in the Western Front and also predominantly in the Ohio Territory, which is right below Lake Erie. This map shows you in that time period between 1763 and the start of the Revolution, just some of the peoples that are there: the Wyandot, the Ottawa, the Miami, the Shawnee, the Delaware or Lenape, and the Mingo. Now, who were the Mingo? They weren't a long-standing nation or anything, but really they were, shall we say, refugees or people that came out of the Lake Ontario area who were previously part of the Iroquois Confederacy. And these would include Seneca and Cayuga people, and they were named Mingo after the fact. And as far as we know, they were fairly migratory through the year. So even though they were in our parts, they weren't here for permanent settlements. They spent their summers up in the Great Lakes region and then went to the lower Ohio Valley during the winters. And then in between, when they were in motion, they found clearings and floodplains where they planted crops, which they would plant in the spring and then harvest in the fall on the way to their winter camps. But the others, I think, were more tied in, definitely when it got to the war period. And you had, during the Revolutionary War, a confederation here in the Ohio Territory that included British regular soldiers and officers based out of Fort Detroit, and the Lenape, Wyandot, Shawnee, Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples who were in this region. So they were all there against the new so-called Americans, who were coming in even larger numbers into western Pennsylvania and putting pressure to push people further westward. And so in that period between 1781 and 1783, there were a lot of skirmishes. There were parties from Pennsylvania into Ohio and vice versa, raiding communities and villages and farms, killing people, taking livestock, all that. And in 1782, there were some very significant things that happened. First and foremost, you had, in March of 1782, there was a Moravian mission in Gnadenhutten, which is down southwest of here, and about 100 Delaware Lenape people who were Christian converts with the Moravians. These were mostly women, children, and elderly men, were killed by a raiding party massacred really from western Pennsylvania. And that really stepped up the raids from the indigenous people, aided by the British, into western Pennsylvania, so that in May of 1782, Colonel William Crawford, who was a regular Continental Army officer for the Americans, he raised a militia of 500 Pennsylvanians and led them into the upper Sandusky watershed in an attempt to confront and push these people ever westward. They ran into this confederation of British and indigenous people. They were defeated on the field. They retreated, and the Confederation followed them, and it became a rout, basically, in terms of fighting while retreating back to Pennsylvania. And it was during all that Colonel Crawford and several other officers and enlisted men were captured. Some of those who were captured escaped, but William Crawford was not one of them, and he was executed and blamed for the Moravian massacre in March of that year and a rather gruesome execution occurred. Here's a primitive painting that depicts Colonel Crawford's execution. And he was stripped naked, his face was painted black, tied to a post and tortured for a couple of hours before he either fell unconscious or died, and then his body was burned. And it's important, I'm not going to get into all the details, but the details were accounted for in writing, in part to incite the Americans in Pennsylvania in terms of this is what you're up against and we have to defend ourselves. And that sense really carried over even after the Revolution, and I don't know when this painting was done, but I'm sure it was many years after the actual Sandusky campaign of 1782. Over in a cemetery called Mount Pleasant Cemetery, which is outside of the borough of New Galilee, Pennsylvania, in Beaver County. This is a personal connection I have. It's the grave of Private William Lowry. And he was born in Chester County, Pennsylvania in the east. He served 2 enlistments in the Revolution in Chester County. And then around 1780, he moved westward into what was then Washington County, but that included Beaver County as well. And his 3rd enlistment was with Colonel Crawford in his expedition to the Upper Sandusky. And it's actually written at the base of his headstone down here that he's a private militiaman for Pennsylvania, Battle of Sandusky, American Revolution. He died in 1842 at the age of 82, but the good fortune he had to survive the Crawford campaign is why I'm here today telling you about it. This is my 4th great-grandfather, by the way. With the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which ended the American Revolution and established really legally and for all intents and purposes the United States of America, things continued to change, especially for indigenous people. Here you see a map of the United States in 1783. The Orange Territory was the United States, and there was some disputed lands, Florida with Spain, and also up related to the British and Canada that were eventually solved, but that large yellow area became known a few years later as the Northwest Territory. And so that was, shall we say, the Great West for the new United States in terms of future development of the country through Ohio, what's now Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Still a lot of indigenous people here at that time period, but some of them were seeing the handwriting on the walls. Some were fighting back from losing land. There was treaties that came out, the Second Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1784, and at some point the Iroquois, what was left of them, just basically gave up on everything except their reservation in New York. And you had new communities forming, especially in the Ohio Valley, with Cincinnati, which was part of what was Fort Washington, and then Marietta, which was across the Muskingum River from Fort Harmar. And so there was fortifications to help protect these people as they were establishing new communities here. And there were continuing skirmishes and raids going on throughout this period. Things really intensified in the 1790s and really further west because the push was on in that direction. And then in 1794, you had the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which was in northwest Ohio. And that was a precursor to 1795, where you had the Treaty of Greenville, where those indigenous people who were left basically ceded everything in Ohio today except for the northwestern quadrants. And so there's a Treaty of Greenville line, which they were supposed to be. And that really opened much of Ohio, most of Ohio, for settlement from people from the east, and in particular here in northeast Ohio, which was then called the Connecticut Western Reserve because the state of Connecticut had laid claim to the land north of the 41st parallel and 120 miles west of the Pennsylvania boundary. And it's here where I want to stop because that's a whole nother story. And but I hope today I've given you a sense of who the people were. It's very broad, obviously, that were here, that we knew their names or we didn't know their names, and there's still evidence of them today.
717 Credit Union, savings power to give your business an extra boost. Business savings, certificates, and business money market. 717 Credit Union, make your money work as hard as you do. Check out our business money market and CD rates at 717cu.com/rates.